It's our weekly podcast mailbag, and surprise, surprise, you want to talk about quarterbacks. Mike White, Zach Wilson. Maybe we'll even find time for a non-quarterback question or two. That's ahead today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, November 30th, 2022, the final day of the second final month of the year, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag. And unsurprisingly, most of our questions today are about the quarterback position. So let's begin. Our first question. John, some have speculated that the Jets might be in the market for an experienced quarterback in 2023, such as Jimmy Garoppolo, who knows the Mike LaFleur system well. I'm in agreement with Robert Saleh riding Mike White as far as he can take the Jets, but I know I'm getting ahead of myself. If he can take the Jets deep into the playoffs, however, and beyond, like Nick Foles with the Eagles, do you see him as the starter next year as well, regardless of who's available? Well, it's a great question. I just think we're, getting a little ahead of ourselves here in this with this speculation, because I think if you asked Robert Saleh right now, and if he was willing to give you an honest answer, he'd tell you he doesn't really know how this is going to play out. He made a comment on Monday that Zach Wilson's still the number one quarterback on this team. Now, on the surface, it's a completely ridiculous comment. Zach Wilson's not currently the number one quarterback on this team. You can't be the number one quarterback on this team and not playing, not in the starting lineup, unless you're injured. That's different. But you can't be healthy on the bench and the number one quarterback on the team. Now, maybe Zach Wilson is a guy the Jets still view as a long-term potential answer at quarterback, but for now he's not. But I think there's a reason Robert Saleh spoke that way. I think there's a method to his madness. And I think Robert Saleh has really improved dealing with the media, because I think he got off to a really rough start with the media last year and then even in training camp this year. I think his media skills have really improved. The reason that answer makes sense is if he says anything else, then the storyline is that the Jets have given up on Zach Wilson. And there's no reason for that story to be in the media, because for all we know, they might have to go back to Zach Wilson at some point. Now, you hope Mike White goes out there and plays great, but we don't really know what Mike White's going to do. Mike White has started 4 games in the NFL, and one of those games he left after the first quarter, so he's really played 3 games start to finish in the NFL. Can you really judge a quarterback 3 games start to finish? The league doesn't really know what Mike White does well and does poorly yet. And I think when you get more film on yourself, that's when you find out whether a guy can stick, because other teams can figure out what you don't do well, and they can try and force you to do that. And if you can figure out a way to succeed after that, then you got a chance in this league. But I think Mike White, based on what happened Sunday, I think one thing changed on Sunday. I think Mike White not only guaranteed himself a game this week against Minnesota, but I think you could say he probably guaranteed himself next week against Buffalo. If Mike White went out there and threw 4 interceptions against the Bears like he did against Buffalo, the Jets would have a problem. They probably would have to make another quarterback change. But now, after the best quarterback game of the season for the Jets, I don't think 1 bad game is enough to get him to the bench. And maybe 2 bad games isn't. And even if Mike White goes to the bench, it's not entirely clear where they're going. There's a possibility they go to Joe Flacco. Now, I'm not guaranteeing it. I think there's also a possibility Zach Wilson's the first guy off the bench, but it's really not clear, because Saleh, you don't know how much of this is Saleh just giving coach speak, but Saleh has kind of indicated that this is a mental rest for Zach Wilson, because Zach Wilson's head's just not in the right place. He's kind of, in over his head. The defenses are really confusing him. Mechanically, he's not great. I'm not sure you're going to fix that in 2-3 weeks. I think at the least it may take a full offseason. Now, maybe the Jets just figure it out. Maybe Zach Wilson just gets into a right place. Anything's possible, but it might be a lot to ask. So I think the best situation for the Jets would be Mike White to continue and play well during the season. But we can't really say what they're going to do this offseason, because Mike White goes out there and plays terrible the rest of the way. Well, then yeah, they are going to make a quarterback change. But if he plays great the rest of the way, then it becomes an interesting decision. I was thinking this through. I was trying to think of comparable situations. Now, one is a Super Bowl team, and it's a pretty iconic Super Bowl team, but everybody talks about the 2000 Ravens with Trent Dilfer. Everybody remembers, they won the Super Bowl with Trent Dilfer. Well, people forget. Trent Dilfer gave the Ravens what they needed. Tony Banks was originally the starting quarterback for the Ravens that year, and the offense was just so bad that they couldn't win games. They were around 500, even with that iconic defense. Dilfer was not spectacular, but he gave the Ravens what they needed. He played competent football. After that season, the Ravens went out and signed Elvis Gerbach from Kansas City, and they thought it would be a big upgrade because Elvis Gerbach had been a Pro Bowler in the past. Went to Baltimore, was terrible, was a downgrade over Dilfer. Another comparable example might be the Minnesota Vikings a few years ago. They had a great season in 2017. They went to the NFC Championship game where they lost to the Eagles. Case Keenum had a great year. And that might be like a good parallel to this. That was the offseason they went out and signed Kirk Cousins. Now you can say, well, Case Keenum's not that good. He worked well within that infrastructure. Who knows how things go if he stays within that team where he knew the system well, where he was succeeding. I think there are some guys who could execute within a certain system, within a certain framework, with certain teammates, who maybe would not do so good in a different situation. They went and got Kirk Cousins. Now, Kirk Cousins is a solid quarterback, and obviously the Vikings are having a good year this year. But, ask most Vikings fans, I think that they'll probably tell you. Now, I'm sure there's some Vikings fans watching here, so you can, leave a comment. If you like, you can tell me if I'm wrong. But I think most Vikings fans would tell you that the Kirk Cousins era has been kind of a disappointment. So, thinking of comparable situations, there are situations where teams made an upgrade to a bigger name, where they've kind of been playing a guy who seemed like a journeyman, and they've downgraded. So that's something that'll come into play, but Mike White has to finish the year first. He has to finish the year strong, because if he doesn't play well the rest of the year, or if Zach Mayo, in a hypothetical world, and I'm not saying I necessarily expect this, but in a hypothetical world where Zach Wilson returns to the lineup and looks really good, well, then we're having a different discussion. So it's tough to say. Our next question: do you think Zach Wilson's preseason injury impacted him negatively this year? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think it helped. I mean, I think it probably had some degree of impact, but I don't think it was a driving force. I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, if it was going to be an issue, you'd think it would really mess up his timing and his chemistry with the receivers right off the bat. And the first game he played this year against Pittsburgh was probably his best performance. That's when he led the fourth quarter comeback. And it doesn't seem like he's been improving as the game reps have continued. You'd think if the preseason was an injury and it was rust and it was lack of chemistry with the receivers, it would begin to work itself out the more he played. And it really was not. I don't think that there was much improvement in Zach Wilson as we continued. Another factor here is the Jets played up all this offseason work he was doing. They made a big deal out of him going to work out with his receivers all offseason. So that should have helped mitigate some of the issues if the preseason injury. So, look, I don't think it helped. I think any time on the practice field can be valuable. I think certainly, it wouldn't hurt for Zach Wilson to have gotten a full preseason and a full training camp. But it's not like it was his first year of the system either. He should be more comfortable. I think last year you could make a better case because he'd still be learning the system. He'd still be learning everything about being an NFL quarterback. In year two, I don't think it should have as big of an impact. That's my view on it, but my answer would probably lean towards no. I'm not saying it had zero impact, but I think it's one of those things. It's a convenient excuse if you're trying to absolve a quarterback. You see it happen all the time. A team figures out a way, or a fan base figures out a way to absolve a quarterback of some struggles, and I don't think it really pans out. I think that Zach Wilson's struggles are really just kind of about him not developing, because I mean a lot of his issues are mechanical, him not developing more consistent mechanics. Also, there are issues with him reading defense. There's a lot that's not going right there. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about Zach Wilson some more. We'll talk about some of the warning signs the Jets coaches and front office may have missed when they drafted him. That's ahead here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Turo. Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. Book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip. Get a classic or luxury car for a special event, birthday, or holiday. Find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from point A to point B. Test drive that new electric vehicle you've had your eye on to see how it fits into your everyday life. Maybe you're heading out to Minnesota for the Jets game this weekend and you need to figure out how you're going to drive. Many Turo hosts can deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo, Turo.com. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that we're sure you're going to love. Find Block Forever now wherever you get your podcasts. Block Forever is a brand new podcast from former NFL All-Pro and former member of the New York Jets, Ryan Khalil, and Audible. Khalil takes the conversation about football to the next level. He gives football fans an insider's look at the game through the eyes of the greatest players and personalities of all time. Khalil sits down with star players, coaches, and former pros across the league to get real about what happens on the field and behind the scenes, inside locker rooms, during team meetings, and back at the hotel. You get to hear Christian McCaffrey talk about his love-hate relationship with fantasy football, and Juju Smith-Schuster give his most honest opinions about other players and positions in the league. And new episodes of Block Forever will be recorded and released every week ahead of Thursday Night Football. So catch the full Block Forever series, available wherever you get your podcasts, available everywhere now. Audible. Get in the game. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh have done a good job, but should they face more criticism in misevaluating Zach Wilson? Saleh tried to say that Zach is not doing the things they drafted him for, but Zach showed his current problems at times at BYU. He just wasn't under pressure that often. I feel like Saleh is trying to blame Zach for not being better than the Jets incorrectly thought he was. Well, it's an interesting question. It's a great point about the pressure because we've seen how rough it's been for Zach Wilson under pressure, and that was one of the huge question marks at BYU. They had a good offensive line, and Zach Wilson did not. Zach Wilson was thrown from a lot of clean pockets, and in the NFL, you got to be able to deliver when the pocket's messy. I don't think you can play quarterback successfully in this league if you can't. I mean, almost every quarterback in the league has pretty good numbers from a clean pocket. Now, some are better than others, but if it was just about a clean pocket, almost anybody could play in this league, and that's why offensive line play is so important. It's tough. You factor everything. I think you throw everything in. I don't think you ever judge a GM or a coach on one move. I think you have to take the full picture, and I think the full picture is pretty good. Now, this is if indeed, and I'm not ready to completely write Zach Wilson off. I think it's gonna be a long road back for him. I'm not sure. I believe he's gonna do it, but I think it is possible for Zach Wilson to come back, but if we're writing him off, it's a big miss at quarterback. But quarterback position is tough to do. It's tough to evaluate. I watched every snap of Zach Wilson at BYU his final year, and really what I saw some good things that I thought may translate and some bad things that may translate. And unfortunately for the Jets, the bad things have translated, but the good things really haven't. I remember a guy who looked like he had a huge arm, guy who was a playmaker, guy who was good throwing on the run, guy who didn't make a ton of complex reads, but to the extent he did, seemed like he got through them pretty well. You really have not seen any of that show up. Meanwhile, what you've seen is a guy with mechanics that fall apart at times, a guy who has some shaky decision-making, a guy who is way too quick to bail on clean pockets. Unfortunately, and it's tough to say because you never know how these guys are going to turn out. If you go back to the Buffalo Bills drafting Josh Allen was an enormous project, but they figured out some mechanical issue that they thought they could fix, and they did it. Josh Allen went somewhere else. And I don't mean to criticize. I don't mean to in any way denigrate what Josh Allen did, because Josh Allen is the number one reason Josh Allen developed. But if he went somewhere else without the kind of coaching, it's a bit of everything. It's the player, it's the coaches. In the Jets' case, I think they just missed on the player. And you can criticize them absolutely, but I think in context of everything they've done right, this is the rare situation where you've really hit a number of home runs. Usually when you're at the beginning of a rebuild and you don't hit it, you miss on the quarterback, that's it. You usually don't hit at a high enough a rate where you can still say these guys are doing a good job. And that's what's happened here with the Jets. So it goes on the record like everything does. But in context, I think that these guys do deserve a chance to pick a second quarterback, because they've gotten, even if they got this one wrong, I do think they've gotten an awful lot right. Next question. With Coach Saleh saying the quarterback situation is a week-to-week thing, it suggests that after one bad start, Mike White will be benched. Do you think this is fair? I personally don't. It's not fair to put the expectation on White that he needs to be nearly perfect every start to keep the job. Mike White gives us the best chance to win football games going forward, even if he has a bad start here or there. It's not like Zach Wilson has a history of consistency. Well, really the question comes down to who gives you the best chance to win. And I think Mike White has earned a little extra leeway. It's always difficult because you have to balance your pre-existing evaluations with what your eyes tell you. You don't draft a guy in the 5th round, and it wasn't actually the Jets who drafted Mike White in the 5th round, it was Dallas. The Jets signed him, in 2019 when he was available in free agency during the season. So you look at this guy, you think, well, he's a practice squad level player. That's how you evaluated him. But at some point, what you see with your eyes has to take over and it becomes more relevant. The fact that you had a good grade on Zach Wilson 2 years ago, that loses relevancy with each passing week because you're getting more and more data points about how he can succeed or not succeed in the NFL against regular NFL competition, not against college competition. So it's always a balance. And I think Mike White had a short leash because the evaluation was that, he was a guy the Jets signed to their practice squad a few years back. So I think they're probably viewed him as a practice squad level quarterback. And that's always the way it is. The guys who come in as low round picks, as practice squatters, as undrafted free agents, they don't have belief. People don't believe in them. So they're quick to, they don't get as many chances because you essentially have to prove your worth when you're one of those guys. Whereas if you're a higher pick, usually the team believes in you, so the team gives you more leeway. I think, though, at this point, looking at what Mike White did on Sunday, it was better than I've seen any Jets quarterback do all year. So I think at some point that has to mean more than anything. So I tend to agree. I don't think Mike White necessarily should get the full rest of the season. I'm not saying that, he should be named the starter the rest of the way, but I do think he's earned more than one bad start and maybe two bad starts because the upside, the ceiling was there. The ceiling, we talk about ceiling all the time, but that was better than anything I've seen. I've heard a couple people say, and some of my friends in the media who I talked about on yesterday's podcast, who are blaming the Jets for how they handled Zach Wilson. I've heard them say Zach Wilson could have done that against the Bears. Well, Zach Wilson's never played that well in the NFL. And I know the Bears are a bad defense, but there's some bad defenses Zach Wilson's gone up against in his 2 years and never played like that. So for me, I think Mike White is the guy going forward, at least for the short term. We can talk about we can talk about a change if he has a couple of bad games, but for now, I think Mike White should be the guy, and I think he should get a little bit more leeway than maybe he would have last week, because last week he goes out and plays a bad game. You could say, well, that Buffalo game last year was just not great. Things are different now, and I think Mike White should be the guy, at least for the short term. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our talk about quarterbacks. Maybe we'll even get a non-quarterback question or two as we close out this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. It feels like just as much pressure as making a quarterback change. It's easy, though, for the Jets. They could just turn to Mike White. Your business doesn't have it so easy. You need to be 100% certain that you can have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn Jobs, then add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question: should the Jets offer Mike White an extension before the end of the season? If White takes the Jets deep into the playoffs, his price in the offseason will go up dramatically. If you went this route, what would you offer right now? I think you got to be in wait-and-see mode, unless White would be willing to take like a huge discounted contract, like something crazy like what he's got right now. Because it doesn't seem like it seems like the Jets are in wait-and-see mode. So, if you were confident White was your guy going forward, then I could see doing it. But it just feels like the Jets need to see more before they're convinced. I don't think you make a move like that, because I understand it's a gamble, but gambles can turn out badly too. So is giving Mike White a big contract right now. Paying Mike White after he's played 2 great games can really backfire on you if he doesn't go out and sustain his level of performance. So I understand the argument, but I just think it's too early for this. I think that you gotta let this play out a little bit more, because if you're making an investment in Mike White and you're just throwing all of your other quarterback options off the table for next year, you got to be really confident in what you're doing. And yeah, I understand maybe you save a few dollars, but for a quarterback, you're always going to make the cap room. Yeah, you lose something else out, but if you prioritize your cap situation, even in a situation where it's going to be fairly tight for the Jets, you're not going to lose a core player. You always lose more peripheral guys. And this is, I think, the mistake people make with the salary cap. They assume that when a team's got a good bunch of good players that they're going to lose a star. Usually you don't lose a star. Usually you lose a guy who's just like a solid starter who you just can't afford. You can always make room for an impact player. You can always make room for a guy at an important position. And you can especially make room for a quarterback. A quarterback is not the guy who you're going to sacrifice for cap space. And cap space matters, but I would not make this decision based on cap space. I'd make this decision on whether I'm sure Mike White's the guy going forward. And our last question, John, what do you think the odds are the Jets and Bills game will be flexed into prime time next week? The Denver game doesn't look very attractive. Now, this is an interesting situation. So, the NFL has to decide this 1 week in advance. So, it was decided on Tuesday what was going to happen. And it will not be the Jets moving to Sunday night. It will be the Dolphins and the Chargers. But, a very interesting point here, NBC apparently wanted to move Jets-Bills to Sunday night. But the way the TV contracts work, CBS and Fox are both allowed to prevent a certain number of games each year from moving to Sunday night because they want to show them. And that's part of the deal is that, CBS and Fox have a certain number of games where they say, you know what, can't flex this one. Apparently CBS used one of their slots to block Jets-Bills from going to Sunday night. So what a turn of events where usually the Jets are at 1, they get the lowest broadcast team CBS has to offer. Now you have two networks fighting them for what could be a premium game. And if the Jets win, this could be another situation where first place is on the line in the AFC East. Tough to believe how far we've come. Isn't that amazing? Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Same goes if you're watching on YouTube. Please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow for Crossover Thursday, Jets and Vikings.